How to estimate for water and fire damage. Now, this is a very loaded question. How to estimate for water and fire damage. First, many independent adjusting companies, if they're sending you out on a claim to inspect for damages, what you should definitely do is have the appropriate equipment with you to give yourself a better idea of the presence of water or fire damage. Now, what do I mean by that? It may seem to a new person that that would be a pretty obvious, easy thing to do. If you go out to a house, I mean, if the ceiling is visibly damaged, if the wall is visibly damaged, and obviously it's damaged, you're going to write a repair estimate for that. Well, that's not always the case. Sometimes there could be a plaster ceiling. It could be freshwater damage that really wasn't that bad. It was enough to soak the materials, but not enough to make any visible damage. You're going to need a moisture meter, something like that. You could have an infrared camera if you want to go that far, but you need some sort of evidence in the event that what happened is not visible by the naked eye. Those little things are some of the most simplest forms of equipment that you can get. As far as equipment goes, you can get in there for something as simple as a chemical sponge. This is a kind of a commercial grade heavy duty sponge that you can use. It's restoration companies would use it to remove soot off of a wall, and it will remove the soot from a wall much better than a normal sponge would, because it actually absorbs the soot rather than smears it around. It's much better to use, and you can use that when you go into a house. You'll find yourself doing certain claims where you might not really be able to see the soot on the walls. The walls could be white, but it might be a very, very, even if you have a great vision, a very, very light coating. You might even only be able to see it on like cobwebs in the corner. But by using a chemical sponge, you can wipe the wall and the soot will accumulate on the sponge. And then you can take a picture of the sponge and say, okay, it might not look like much. It might not even be exposed in the camera. But when I take this sponge and I wipe the wall, this is soot. There's soot on this wall, and we need to address that. So, that all being said, how do you estimate for something like that? Well, it also depends. Certain with regard to water damage, certain companies will allow you. If I'm going to speak as if we're using the Exactimate estimating software. If you're using Exactimate, there are certain line items that are built into Exactimate that give you additional allowances to remove wet material. Some companies will allow you to use that. Some companies will not allow you to use that. Obviously, I would prefer the companies allow you to use that. Some of the arguments for them not allowing you to use that is because they're not going to a general contractor or whoever they get to come out to make those repairs are not going to actually hire a water restoration company to come out there and do this work. So for that reason, these set of line items inside of Exactimate, they don't want you using them. And I think that that is bullshit. Here's why. Removing a piece of wet drywall, soaking wet drywall, is not as easy as removing a dry piece of drywall. Anybody that has ever done demo would be in agreement with that. Let's exercise some common sense right now. If you were in a dry room, completely dry, and you were given the task of just taking drywall off of the wall, and you've done this before, you're not so much thinking about the difficulty, how much of a hassle this will be. You're really thinking about whether or not you can get any good pulls off the wall where you're pulling it down and you just get a nice big chunk of it, a nice 16 square foot area, because you kind of want to get the biggest piece off. What you don't want is little tiny pieces, taking little tiny pieces off, right? You want like the big chunks. It's like getting the sticker off of a package, right? Or getting Christmas times coming, getting a price tag off. You don't want to get little bits and pieces of that price tag off the box. You want to get the entire thing. And you kind of get that little high when you get a nice, big, good rip off of it. That's the same with drywall. But in order for that to happen, the drywall needs to be dry, right? Now let's imagine that it's not. The drywall is wet. You may have even seen when it gets wet enough, you could poke your hole in it. So if drywall gets wet enough and you can poke your hole in it, poke your finger through it and create a little tiny hole. If you just tried to pull that off, how big of a piece do you realistically think you're going to get? Not much. You're just going to get a handful. You're going to get a handful and you're going to start pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling. And it's going to take a little while. Now, let's consider that all being said, exercising logic. which process, which material, dry drywall or wet drywall, which will take more time, the dry drywall or the wet drywall, or will they take equal time? This is common sense. It's going to take longer to get the wet drywall off. So why would you create a repair estimate that suggests that the difficulty and time involved to remove dry drywall from the wall should be the same as wet drywall? If you're going to use the same line item in your estimate that you would for dry as you would with wet, then while knowing that it is going to be more difficult for that person to pull that drywall out and it's going to take them more time. If you know that and you're going to use the same line item anyway, then you are voluntarily giving them the less than what they're owed. You're giving them less than what's going to be needed. And it's easy for an independent to do that. It's easy for an estimator to do that, but it's appalling when a insurance carrier believes that that's what you should do. So, estimating for water damage, you should really rely on the correct line items that are specific to water. Antimicrobial. Now, then there's a dispute. Inside of Xactimate, you have different allowances that you can put in there for drying equipment. Water restoration companies are going to be using these line items: air movers, dehumidifiers, potentially air scrubbers and things like that. I don't completely believe that they should be in every single estimate because most contractors are just not. If you know me by now, then you know that I am on the side of giving the policyholder as much, that we could possibly get away with so that they can get what is actually needed to get the repairs done. Now, that, of course, that comes to an extent. Now, when we're talking about putting in equipment, if I'm dealing in a nursery or a child daycare and a business that needs to keep running, I'm probably going to put an allowance in there to get some drying equipment on there because we're also going to be dealing with a business interruption exposure. Okay. So the idea here is to say, we're going to give you more on the property damage end so that it limits the exposure on the business interruption end. But when dealing inside of residential repairs, it is extremely rare that a contractor is going to come in weeks, probably weeks after the claim is settled, come in there, take out wet materials, and then set up equipment. They're just not going to do that. Here's what's actually going to happen. They're going to come in, things are going to be drier. They're going to rip out materials, and then some days later, they're going to come back and put it back up. That's just how it is. Now, if it ends up being different, okay. If they end up doing that, fine. You could potentially handle that on a supplement, given the time, given the accuracy, given the reasonability of the timeline. But otherwise, it's just, if you had a water damaged house and it was damaged by water on January 1st, and by February 1st, somebody is out there actually making the repairs. If a qualified contractor would put equipment out there if it was absolutely needed, would that occur more than 50% of the time? And my argument is that it would not. Certainly would not. And for that reason, I don't include it in there. Now, for things like fire damage, how to properly estimate for fire damage. Another thing you have to remember too, if there was a fire, odds are at some point after the fire, there was water. So you'd be using a lot of the similar things. The same ideas apply with equipment. I mean, typically I will not put in air scrubbers or anything to really improve the air quality outside of just a ozone machine just to get the odor out most of the time. Because if it's fire damage, you may be replacing entire pieces of materials that have an excessive amount of soot on them. Otherwise, you're just cleaning. You're cleaning. Maybe you're painting over to prevent odor. On very light, like soot claims and minor fire damage claims, you're really just you're just improving odor. A lot of times, you could probably rip me apart for that, but it's what it seems from from my position. Replacing what's significantly damaged and then just removing color and odor from everywhere else.